Greetings. Now, I realize that some who watch this video might wonder what the point is of looking at the individual that we'll be looking at here, but I do think that there is some value in documenting the more obscure or fringe corners of the diverse Israelite spectrum, and therefore I'm making this video because I feel that at least some might find this interesting, whether now or in the near future. So with that in mind, I'd like to open with a clip from the video that you see on your screen, which is a Facebook video by al-MaseeHee, which aired back on December 11th. And we're going to pick the video up at the 17-minute, 26-second mark. And it's a discussion between Mitzilel, who is a teacher of Hebrew, and he's having that discussion with a particularly curious individual who calls himself Israelite William. And in this clip, Israelite William will share what he believes about the King James Bible and the language of the Israelites, as well as the language of Scripture, the original language of Scripture. And he's also going to share a bit of his methodology for arriving at his conclusions. And I would submit that what you're going to hear here constitutes perhaps one of the starkest examples of an approach in which an individual holds that nothing can trump his personal private interpretation of Scripture, right? So, without further ado, let's get to the clip, which will run for slightly over 4 minutes. Here you go.
For me to believe an historian's claim, it would have to line up with Scripture, because that's my foundation. And so, there's no such thing as a Masorite in the Bible. There's no such thing as a Masoretic text. No prophet, no prophecy ever spoke of a time where non-Jews and non-Israelites would have to translate Israelite holy books. And so I don't believe that no non-Jews or non-Israelites translated any Israelite holy book. That's not written. What's written in the Bible is that God won't do anything unless he reveals this to his prophets. His prophets never spoke of that. So that means it wasn't revealed to them. So if it wasn't revealed to them, and my understanding is that it wasn't happening. And so therefore, I look at King James as one of the last kings of Israel and of Jerusalem, and most likely the one that was carried into captivity with us. Because if you look at Deuteronomy 28, it says that the Israelites and their king would be carried into captivity. Also, like I said, each Israelite king was required to write a book of the law. There are no books that so-called historians and so-called archaeologists claim that they found in Jerusalem. So also the 70 AD story of Jerusalem, I don't believe it, because once again, that's not Scripture. That was never prophesied in Scripture that there would be, like, because listen, if the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, that would mean it's almost 2,000 years later, and we've been out of Jerusalem ever since then. There's no prophecy that says we would be in a 2,000-year exile or 2,000-year captivity. The longest captivity we was ever prophesied to be in was 400 years. See what I'm saying? So my understanding is that less than 400 years ago, we was in Jerusalem, because when that 400 years is up, the prophecy is that this captivity is over. And so I deal with what's written, I deal with Scripture. Also, there's no prophecy, there's no prophet saying that the Israelites would forget their language. No captivity that we ever went in did we forget our language. There's no implication anywhere in Scripture that says we would ever forget our language in any captivity. So therefore, I don't believe that we forgot our language. So therefore, this language that we speaking right now, which we call English, I believe is the language that the Israelites spoke in Israel and in Jerusalem.
So, so you're saying the language English?
The language we call English that we speaking right now, I don't believe this is English. I believe this is our language. I believe that when the heathens conquered Israel and took us into captivity, they learned our language because scripture tells us that when they come, we would not understand their speech. And say we would eventually learn their speech. It says, you shall not understand their speech. So shout not means we won't. It doesn't mean eventually we will. And we assume that we forgot our language and they taught us their language because that's the narrative that they gave us. That narrative has nothing to do with scripture. That's not in the Bible nowhere. You see what I'm saying?
I do. So, um,
So there you heard it. He basically stated that he's going to reject anything that cannot be found in Scripture, and or put slightly differently, and I hope he forgives me if this comes off as disrespectful, but it might be better put as saying that he's going to reject anything that cannot be found in his private interpretation of Scripture, and by Scripture he means the King James Bible, or more specifically the King James Old Testament. And aside from his argument that the KJV Old Testament could not have been translated from the Masoretic text because the Masoretes aren't mentioned in Scripture, aside from that, one particularly interesting part was when he explained that Deuteronomy 28:49 says the Israelites won't know the language of their captors. And then he noted that the verse does not say that eventually they will learn that language. Therefore, from that, he reasoned that if both the captors and the captives understand English today, it can't be because the captives learned English from their captors. Rather, the captors must have learned English from their Israelite captives. And from that, he concluded that English is therefore the Israelite language. In short, the KJV Old Testament was not translated from Hebrew and Aramaic. Rather, according to the reasoning of Israelite William, the KJV Old Testament is original Israelite scripture, which has always been in English. And with that in mind, I'd like to show, in case you think you're not sure if that's exactly what he said, I'd like to show you this Facebook post that he put up back on December 29th. So this was put up about 2.5 weeks after that discussion with MaseeHee. And so I want to read this to you quickly, because this is him basically putting up a testament of faith, clarifying what he believes. It's sort of like his catechism almost, right? And this is what he writes. He writes, "Peace, family. Let me state my belief about who King James is and the origin of the Bible, since I get these questions a lot. First, I believe that the so-called English language is the language that was spoken by the ancient Israelites. I don't subscribe to the theories, emphasis on theories, the theories of historical linguistics or comparative linguistics, which offer false explanations about the origin of the world's languages, because those theories contradict Scripture. I believe that King James was an Israelite king over Judah in Jerusalem, possibly the last king who was prophesied to be carried into captivity with us. I believe that when the white man captured Jerusalem, they found King James' copy, quote unquote, of Scripture, which every Israelite king was required to write. Also, I recently came to believe that they added the New Testament to it and created the Holy Bible. I believe that the 1611 King James Version is a hoax, along with all other writings outside of the Old Testament. I subscribe to the book that our great-grandparents had, which is the King James Bible, but I do understand that the New Testament is false and that it's part of the curses that was prophesied in Deuteronomy 28. I believe Latin, Hebrew, and Koine Greek are all constructed languages, meaning that people created these languages in modern times and no population ever spoke them." And end quote. I'll stop it there. But I think that makes his beliefs pretty clear. I hope you get a sense of what he believes. And with that, I'd like to show one last post, and this will sort of be the centerpiece, because this is some of the discussion here is what I wanted to show, and then I wanted to maybe clarify and highlight a little bit of what's shown here. So this is a thread from January 2nd, and it's on Israelite Williams' page, and he's referring to the topic of the thread is the aforementioned Hebrew teacher, MaseeHee, and, it's about how he considers MaseeHee a liar when he claims that the Bible was written in Hebrew, right? And, MaseeHee challenged him on this point about whether the Bible was written in English, and so, he disagrees, right? So I left a comment on there. I'd say our correspondence didn't go well, but nonetheless, I'd like to show the correspondence. I left a comment on there, and this is what I wrote. I said, you should engage him, and him being Mitzilel, I said, you should engage him on the evidence for and against the Old Testament being written in Hebrew or English. For example, Genesis 16:11. In Hebrew, one can see the relationship between the child being called Yishmael and the Lord having heard, but it makes no sense in English. Another example, Genesis 25:26. In Hebrew, one can see the relationship between Jacob holding Esau's heel and the former receiving his name, Yaakov. In English, the thoughts seem unrelated. The Hebrew Bible has numerous examples of such wordplay that only make sense in Hebrew. And the man you highlighted in your post, that's Mitzilel, the man you highlighted in your post could explain that wordplay to you in detail if you take the time to talk with him with an open heart and mind. And so Israelite William responded. He said, you follow men, I don't. There's nothing you or him can teach me about God. I don't care what you think about that fake language. Tell that to somebody that's stupid enough to believe it. If you read the post and stop being a cheerleader, you would see that I caught your little buddy lying about that fake Hebrew Bible. Do you know why he didn't deny it? Because it's on video, so he can't deny it. Now get up out of here and go preach to some Arabs about whatever y'all supposedly believe in. Do you see me trying to teach you how to ride a camel? Don't talk to me about my God. You don't even know my God. So the camel thing, that's familiar for anyone who's seen my videos about Tawab Racha. Unfortunately, some people go there, and with all due respect to Israelite William, I think when it gets that acrimonious, I'm always tempted to interpret that as a sign of intellectual frustration. But nonetheless, attempting to continue to be charitable, I responded. I said, greetings, William. Permit me to quote portions of your post so as to be clear what precisely I'm replying to. William wrote, and then I quote him saying, you follow men, I don't. And then I responded to that. I said, I don't think this really addresses the point about the wordplay in Hebrew that does not make sense in English. Why precisely was Jacob called Jacob? Why was Ishmael called Ishmael? Consider another example. Genesis 4:25. In English, quote, and she called his name Seth, for God, said she, hath appointed me another seed, end quote. That statement does not make sense. However, the Hebrew, Watikra et shmo Shet, ki shatli Elohim zera, does make sense. There is an obvious play on words happening. The reason the wordplay is lost in the English text is precisely because the English text is a translation, and the wordplay gets lost in the translation. I would invite you to consider this point seriously. And then I quote him talking about the little Mitzilel lying, and I asked him, can you elaborate on the alleged lie? So he responded by writing back to me, I don't care about your interpretation of Scripture. What don't you understand about that? And so I responded to that. I said, William, the issue is one of truth. The question remains of how you explain the verses and points which have been presented to you. Why not engage the argument directly? And then I added to that, I said, here's another example, Hosea 1:9. The KJV has, quote, call his name Lo Ami, for ye are not my people, end quote. But how does Lo Ami relate to them not being God's people? What does Lo Ami even mean in English? In the Hebrew text, it makes perfect sense. And then I transliterate and quote the Hebrew, Kara shemo lo ami ki atem lo ami. In Hebrew, lo ami means not my people. It means nothing in English. The wordplay is in Hebrew, and that wordplay is lost in the English translation. And unfortunately, he wasn't interested in discussing that. He writes to me, Abdel-Masih al-Manhatani, the reason I won't debate with you, which you already know, is because you already played yourself before with your disrespectful mouth. I heard everything you're saying 1,000 times before, and it's easy to explain, but I'm not explaining nothing to you, Habib. I think he meant Habib, I don't know. If somebody else asks me, then I'll explain it to them, not to you. You don't even fear God. The only thing you fear is deodorant. Okay. But there was another person, apparently, who was hitting like on certain posts, so he addressed that person, a person who went by the name Ban Yasharallah, and he says, Ban Yasharallah, I'll explain myself to you, my brother. I'm about to block this dirty little infidel. He's not on our side, brother. He doesn't even admit that we are the chosen people. Don't let these snakes infiltrate our ranks. Me and you can disagree all day, and we're still brothers. He's not our brother. The reason those verses do make sense in English is very simple. Names have meanings. The name Judah means praise. The name Moses means drawn from the water. The name Noah means comforter. You don't need another language for that to make sense. Even my name, William, has a modern definition, which might or might not have been made up by white people. I don't know. But either way, if my mother had said she was going to name me William because I'm going to be a warrior and protector, then that would make perfect sense without that statement being a translation, because that's what the name William means, end quote. I think there's a problem here, is that Moses does not mean drawn from the water in English. You know, that would really be the question. When you say this name means that, this name means that, the question should be, in what language does it mean that, right? That would be the real question. Now, at this point, this video is already over 15 minutes long, so perhaps I should start to wrap it up. But I wanted to quickly share a graphic which attempts to illustrate the point that I was attempting to make. So returning to Hosea 1:9, in the Hebrew text, the name Lo Ami is directly related to what God said about the people. Lo Ami, not my people. Now, William can wave his hand and say that Lo Ami means not my people. So what? Names have meaning. So what? But as I just alluded to, the question needs to be asked. In what language does Lo Ami mean not my people? Right? That's not an English phrase. Rather, that's a Hebrew phrase. And those who know Hebrew can spot that immediately. You know, they would be able to identify the negation, the noun, and the possessive suffix. And they would recognize that the possessive suffix is specifically first person singular. And none of this would be accessible to a person who was trying to only go by knowledge of English alone. And we can have similar discussions about the other verses that I mentioned, right? We can discuss the common roots and the verbs and nouns which spring from those roots, right? For Israelite William to just say, oh, names have meanings, you know, so what? For him to just say that and throw it out there leaves open the question of what language those meanings are from, right? These are clearly and unambiguously Hebrew terms. And that's going to be obvious to anyone familiar with Hebrew. And that would raise a question for William's analogy. Why would the ancient Israelites be consistently reaching for specifically Hebrew names? Doesn't that strongly imply that the surrounding culture was a Hebrew culture, that they were part of a Hebrew culture, a Hebrew-speaking culture? Or will William just say, well, you know, ancient Israelites were merely English speakers who existed in an environment where Hebrew names were laying around, just like today, right? He might say that. But if so, what would that imply? Well, would that imply that there were vestiges of a still earlier Hebrew culture, which predated the time of these, you know, supposed ancient English-speaking Israelites, right? How would that work? You know, but I digress, right? Of course, Israelite William is welcome to comment on this video if he wants to, as I don't censor anyone. You know, I don't threaten to block people. So it would be nice if he attempted to clarify his worldview, you know, perhaps engage in questions and counter arguments, as all sorts of methodological and epistemological questions remain. But I'm not confident that he would do so. But I just wanted to put it out there that if he wanted to, he's always welcome to comment here. And once this video is up, I'll share it with him. I'll attempt to share it with him. But regarding those methodological and epistemological questions, you know, for example, recall that his approach was to trust the King James Bible because that was what his grandmother had. But what if someone else's grandmother had a Spanish translation of the Bible, right? Should they reapply William's reasoning and conclude that the ancient Israelites spoke Spanish and the Bible was originally written in Spanish, right? How are we supposed to distinguish between such competing proposals, right? You know, and some of us are old enough to remember when certain people had Latin Bibles, right? There are people, including old people, including people's grandparents, who had the Vulgate, right? They had the Bible in Latin. So does that mean the ancient Israelites were speaking Latin? There's a question of methodology here, and there's a question of starting assumptions here, and the reasoning, right? But with that in mind, I'll share this closing thought, right? I think that this is a glaring, perhaps even extreme example of trends which we see elsewhere in certain other corners of the diverse Israelite spectrum. The approach that some take is often very specific to the Anglosphere, very Amerocentric, and then more narrowly self-centered, right? Here we have an individual limiting everything to his personal experience, which falls within an Anglophone and American environment, and then setting his personal experience as the final arbiter. You know, as I noted, we can say that this is an extreme case, but the broad strokes are neither unprecedented nor unfamiliar. Food for thought. But with that, I'll close this video here. As always, I welcome any comments, questions, or criticisms, so feel free to share your thoughts, whether positive or negative, and God bless.